Just begin or?
Oh, somebody's going to
Okay.
introduce you here. Sorry, I was asking about the recording.
Okay.
So resume with the next session. We'll first have the presentations and then have the questions later on so that we handle time efficiently there. So our first presentation here is the medieval empires of the Western Sudan and the Trans-Saharan trade, an advocacy for reorientation considered. This presentation is by Theo Randall from Indiana University. Theodore Randall,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the floor is yours.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. When I received the call for papers for this year's conference, when I saw the title, uh, Information, Miseducation, and Epistemic Violence, I said, I definitely have to present. And so with that said, let me go ahead and start my presentation. I'm going to share my screen with you right now. It says post-disabled participant screen sharing. And so I usually show images. Is there a way you can set that so I can show
Sorry,
some
Okay.
of the slides?
I got you. Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
All right, so let me do that again. So, all right, yeah, all right, we're in business. All right, good. And so to start this off, I have to give you a brief narrative about kind of my experiences with African American studies and African American culture. I'm an African American, 55 years old, and I can remember during my youth just traveling to different places, I would run into these particular set of paintings, which were actually quite inspirational. And these paintings were actually, now that I'm an adult and a scholar, and actually I'll show you some of these paintings first. This is from the Kings and Queens of Africa series. I remember seeing these as a young lad back in the 80s, in my mid-teens or so, but they would show Africans at their finest. You would see various kings, emperors, queens, showing them in all their regalia, usually having oftentimes a very kind of commanding presence. And because of that, as an African American, especially during the 80s and 90s, this was kind of the peak of like the Afrocentric era, this time in our history where you'd see many people wearing little medallions with Africa on there. And so this fit in just perfectly. And here, what you see, if you can see this, is actually is a is an example of that. Let me see here. There we go. And so, can you guys see that right there? So this is a picture of Sonny Ali, one of the kings of Songhai, and so you can see all these soldiers marching there. You can see Sunni Ali with his sword standing very regal, you know. And then if you look at at the bottom of the image here, you see the Songhai Empire, and then in the corner you see Budweiser. This particular paintings, the set of paintings were supported and promoted by Budweiser as part of their like community theme. And so here's another one of Askia Mohammed Toure, another king of Songhai, and similar theme as what we saw with the previous painting. And like I said, when I was a youth, I would see these. And here's another one, which we will focus on this one here today. But I teach at Indiana University South Bend, and before this I taught at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And I can remember in the anthropology department, you would see these paintings. And I thought that's quite interesting because it's sponsored by Budweiser, but Budweiser is based in St. Louis, so it kind of does make sense. But some of this information isn't, I would say it's accurate, but it only tells one side of these kings. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to do this by focusing on Mansa Musa, King Moses, if you want to translate that. And let me just go into this. And so if you can look at this particular painting right here, you can see Timbuktu right here, and then you see Cairo, and you see arrows pointing to travel from Timbuktu eventually to Mecca. And what this is actually discussing or showing is this pilgrimage that Mansa Musa took from actually Nani, which is a city in what is today Guinea, to Mecca. He went on a pilgrimage from 1324 to 1325. And on the way, he went with, let me see here, tens of thousands. He went with between 12 to 15,000 people. And many of the people that were with him carried gold with them. He went with so much gold, it actually severely affected the economy of Cairo, because as he was traveling, he was, in a sense, blinging, showing a lot of his gold, giving a lot of his gold away. And oftentimes it was gold dust. The emperors would use, and kings would usually keep the nuggets to themselves, but it's still gold. But let me see here. And so this pilgrimage from Nani to Mecca got the attention to not just people on the way to Cairo and Mecca, but also people in Europe. And actually, 50 years after this pilgrimage to Mecca, the Catalian Atlas in 1375, which is a Spanish atlas of the known world at this time, actually showed northwestern Africa. And if you can see this, you see a gentleman riding a camel. You see also, though, a dark-skinned gentleman with a crown of gold, a scepter of gold, and holding this large gold nugget. And so because of this, we know about Mansa Musa, but also this put Timbuktu on the map. This brought the attention to the Europeans to find the source of this gold. And the reason why the Mali Empire became the Mali Empire is that they controlled access to the gold sources, which you would find in southern Senegal and in Mali and in Guinea. And that's where actually all these so-called great empires of the Western Sudan became popular. I put so-called in parentheses, not to deny their greatness, but also to talk about the kind of sore or rotten underbelly of these great empires. And once again, this is my motivation for this particular talk. And you see that reflected here. And so this is a painting of a map, actually in a text called the Atlas of Anthropology, and it's showing the Mali Empire. And here you see in the purple here the space, the actual geographic extent of the Mali Empire, and we're talking about 1,500 miles, almost 1,500 miles north-south, east-west, and about 600-700 miles north-south at its widest extent. Here you see Timbuktu here, which is once again this very popular city, but was also meaning out in the middle of nowhere. And you see Nani, which is in Guinea once again, and that route, in a sense, at least going on its way to Cairo. But also what this map shows is the trans-Saharan trade. That's why these empires in the Western Sudan became popular and became powerful, because of their trade in gold, especially in gold. But also take a look at this map here, and you can see other trade items as well. You see textiles, you see the koala nut, which is kind of like a Western African coffee in a sense. It's a stimulant. You see salt being exchanged, beads, but also if you look, you see ebony, ivory, and you see slaves. And this is this miseducation that I want to talk about. Oftentimes when people speak of these empires, and when I say empires, I'm talking about not just the Mali Empire, but the ancient Ghana Empire that occurred before that, and then the Songhai Empire after that, and even the Hausa states, which are further east. But a lot of these empires also had slaves, and we oftentimes don't hear about that. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about slavery in pre-contact Africa. And so these empires became powerful because of their involvement in the trans-Saharan trade, which was mostly gold, but slavery was part of this as well. When the Muslims moved into North Africa, they carried some of the same traditions that they carried in Arabia, and some of this was slavery. And so what happened is that these empires also start to exchange slaves with these empires or these states in the north. Okay, and also at this time, when these empires are interacting with the Muslim groups in the north, they're also starting to convert to Islam. and they're also expanding at the same time. And so what ends up happening here is you tended to see this combination between territorial expansion and the expansion of slavery. Now, who was enslaved? Those who were enslaved, especially as these empires became more and more Islamic, the people that tended to become enslaved were non-Muslims or even nominal Muslims, Muslims in name only. Okay, and so that's something we need to talk a bit more about. Okay, and that's what I'm doing right now. Don't discount the greatness of those empires, but also let us not ignore that slavery was a part of this as well. And actually, if you look at the trans-Saharan slave trade, which occurred from about 650 AD to about 1600, and even sporadically up into the early 1900s, we're talking about 5 million people were transported from what was called Lam, the areas where you could be enslaved, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, usually beneath the Niger River, south of the Niger River. These were areas that weren't very Muslim, and they would once again be transported north. And even if you include the Red Sea trade, which would eventually go to the Arabian Peninsula, even as far east as the Indian Ocean, as India, you can add another 2.5 million. And so that's in total over 7 million people were enslaved at this time. And what this does is it starts to set up networks for the slave trade that would occur during the transatlantic slave trade. And so we can't be too proud of these guys, because it actually once again sets up the networks for the transatlantic slave trade to occur. And as someone who's a descendant of people that were brought here from West Africa, you can see why that would be an interest. Okay, and so given that slavery did exist in the Western Sudan prior to contact with Muslims in the north, and I want to say a little bit about that as well. Most slaves were either war captives, those defeated in battle, or taken in raids, and those taken in raids would occur more when slavery started later in the trade between like 1500 to 1800, when the Europeans started to get involved. But also, if you are an offspring of a slave, you may still be a slave as well. But also prisoners, punishments for crimes, and sometimes these crimes were people who are trying to take over particular kingships and such. But over time, even minimal crimes would be punishable by slavery, even to the extent that if someone stole a pipe. Okay, but this was more so during the transatlantic slave trade, but it has its origins prior to that. But also those who possessed an unpaid debt would also be susceptible to slavery. And so slavery did exist in this part of Africa prior to Western contact. But also there's other forms of labor. Some of this labor would be serfdom, similar to what you would have in Europe. Pretty much you would be a peasant in a sense. You're working for someone who owns the land. Also clientage, a person may subordinate themselves to someone to be taken care of. And so they would almost like an indentured servant to a great extent, but also wage labor and even pawnship. People in debt would sell themselves to someone for a period of time. And so you had these types of labor as well, which shouldn't be confused with slavery. In addition, the slavery that did occur prior to Western contact was minimal. We're talking about 1,000 people a year transported from sub-Saharan Africa to Northern Africa. Compare that to what occurred during the transatlantic slave trade, where you'd get on average around 30,000 people a year in the 1700s. And even it peaked in the 1800s to as much as 80,000 a year. And so I still don't quite believe that number. So I'll say between 30 to 80,000, but still it really magnified. But so slavery did occur prior to Western contact, but it was minimal compared to what you would see during the transatlantic slave trade. But it started to increase during the trans-Saharan slave trade due to these empires. And that's something we should not neglect. And so what we oftentimes talk about when we speak and talk about the glory of Africa is we tend to focus on centralized societies. These are societies that that are characterized by having stratified social organization and formal leadership. And what I mean by that is you have different ranks in society. Some people in the society are considered better than other people. That's what I mean by the stratified. Think of even like a social class, but also formal leadership. And what I mean by that is you have an actual leader, and that leader leads through authority, not influence. Okay. And of course, this leadership would be inherited through bloodlines, through kinship. And what's interesting is centralized societies did not exist in Africa prior to 2,500 years ago. And it started to begin with this trade. It started to begin with more effective food production strategies, which led to surpluses, which led to wealth disparities and thus power disparities. But also in these societies, you start to get the development of caste systems. And in particular, in West Africa, it consisted of the freeborn, and this includes rulers, warriors, and farmers, but also these occupational castes, such as blacksmiths, griots, then also slaves. There would be domestic slaves and war captives. Domestic slaves were treated a lot differently than war captives. You couldn't actually sell domestic slaves unless they murdered someone. And even the slave could even choose to leave one master and go to another. So quite different than what you'd find in European slavery. And examples of this would be those great empires I just talked about. Now, what I would argue is that we need to make a reorientation to look more at segmented societies. And so segmented societies are characterized by being egalitarian. People respond and interact with each other as equals. If there is leadership, it is temporary and it's done through influence, not through authority. Kinship is more important. Family alliances are more important than let's say hierarchies and such. Okay. And examples of that would be people like the Balanta, the Jola, the Manjago, and the Papel of Guinea-Bissau. Okay. And oftentimes these groups were targets of those centralized groups. And so if you scratch an African-American here, you oftentimes find they are related to some of these groups. For example, I've taken some genetic tests and I found that on my father's side, I belong to the Balanta group. Okay. And so this map here shows where these particular groups inhabit, these segmented groups, oftentimes in the more swampier areas harder for the more centralized groups to get to. And so what we should learn more about is that when the Portuguese arrived in this part of West Africa, they were oftentimes fought off and repulsed by these segmented groups. And matter of fact, the Portuguese would say, these people are swamp people, they're uncivilized. They don't want to engage in slavery like groups like the Mandinka. Okay, and so for about 25 years, the Jola kept the Portuguese from traveling up the river to work with the Mandinka to capture slaves. And so those are stories we should focus more on, not as much the glory of the great Mali and Songhai empires. And here, this photo gives you an example of the Jola, and this was taken by a French photographer in the early 1900s. And here you can see the Jola people, segmented people, wearing more traditional clothing, and actually comparing that to the Mandinka and the Wolof folks. So here's a Wolof man with a Wolof chief with his griot. I kind of think of it like a Flavor Flav and Chuck D and Flavor Flav. I mean, it's almost, you kind of see these traditions here as well. And then here you see the Mandinka here in more flowing robes compared to less clothed Jola people. And so to sum this up, the Jola did not practice slavery. As a matter of fact, they had a very antagonistic relationship with the Mandinka, to the extent that the term Jola is not even what they call themselves. They used to traditionally call themselves the Ajamatu. Jola actually is a Mandinka word that means payback. And I can remember when I was doing my research in the Gambia, it would say, people would say, we used to be called the Ajamatu, and they're quite proud of that. And the word payback comes from their desire to revenge what is wrong to them. And they would say things such as, the Jola would say, if you give us sugar, we'll give you honey. But if you give us blood, we'll give you pus. So they'll even be harder on you. And so to me, that's things we should value. And then to this day, the Jolas still tend to be more segmented. So in response, then, we need to put more of an emphasis on the segmented societies, maybe downplay our emphasis on these more centralized societies. And the reason why is that these centralized societies, in a sense, provided that format to perpetuate and to fuel the transatlantic slave trade. And so clearly a reorientation is needed. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Theodore, for that
Mhm.
presentation.
Mhm.
Thank you. And so we will take questions after we finish with the other presenters.
Mhm.
Our next presenter is presenting on race, ethnicity, and media responses to political violence. And that is Angela Danso Gayen, University of Missouri.
Give me one moment as I put it up.
All right. So Theodore, would you take a comment, question while we're waiting for Angela to set up?
Sure, sure. Uh-huh.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, there's a comment.
Man, I just wanted to say that technically I'm a Jola in all of because my grandparents are from Ziguinchor, Casamance.
Oh, wow. Kasumai.
My mom and my dad boss, in fact, from Ziguinchor, Casamance.
Oh, wow. Kasumai Kip.
Yeah, and I
Kasumai.
second that because Jola are known to be like robust,
Yes.
not me,
Yes.
also really resistant, like almost like stubborn, big headed.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, matter of fact, I found that I belong to the Balanta group, at least according to African ancestry DNA. And I didn't know anything about the Balanta. I've studied Jola, which is just pretty much the group next door. And the word Balanta means those who resist. And so it's that antagonism towards these centralized groups. And if you talk to the Mandinka to this day, they're oftentimes afraid of the Jola and the Balanta because they have this history of fighting against the Mandinka, but also fighting amongst themselves as well. So that's something. Any other questions while we're waiting?
Angela, would you like us to go ahead and go with the third presenter while you're setting up, or will you be ready to
Yes,
go?
please. Can you pull up
Okay,
the third presenter?
Okay. All right. So the third presenter, who is now our second presenter, is presenting on misinformation and epistemic violence, social media, and Nigerian women's reproductive health. Helen Ufoma Uga, University of Kansas.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Helen Uga, and I'll be presenting on misinformation and epistemic violence, social media and Nigerian women's reproductive health. Now, the reason why the MAAAS is in brackets is because the information on social media is not always or misinformation or disinformation. I think we all know that the social media is a platform where you can learn, unlearn, and relearn. But as much as you can learn a lot from social media platforms, you can also mislearn on anything that you have interest in. Now, why the interest in women's reproductive health? Okay, it's not sharing.
So I can do it. Good to go. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Okay. Continue on.
All right. Since time immemorial, women's bodies have always garnered or gathered attention from the public sphere, from different people, basically because I think to a large extent we can ascribe this to patriarchy that has assumed women's body on the one hand as unimportant, not worth being investigated on, and then on the other hand being something that men assume to be very knowledgeable about. So these assumptions or stereotypical assumptions about women's bodies have sometimes influenced the nature of research and production and knowledge production about women's bodies, especially for instance in medicine, where women are not as much are not always participants in clinical trials when compared to men, which I think to some extent has created like I think some kind of medical misnomer for women, because when men's bodies or when only men are used as objects in clinical trials, the outcome or indication of these medical products are always based on what happens to the men and not to the women. Now, another reason again why I'm interested in women's health is because women's reproductive health is basically everything about the woman. A woman that has any kind of challenge with her reproductive health will not have a good quality of life. And women's health cuts across several contexts or phenomena like their menstrual health, use of contraceptive and family planning method, maternal health in terms of pregnancy, labor, and as well as even, in fact, even up to childcare. It also encompasses other contexts like fertility and infertility, STDs, reproductive cancers, menopause and aging, reproductive rights, reproductive justice, abortion, bodily autonomy, and the rest of all that. So we can see that women's reproductive health encompasses a lot of issues, and any form of misinformation about a woman's health can have serious implications for both her and, in fact, the general public as well. Now, still talking about women's health and general societal perception. Earlier on, I talked about how the social media is a platform for generation of information, okay? Now, everyone uses social media, men, women, children, boys, or girls. As much as it's been ascertained that the social media is a platform for generation of information and misinformation, to a large extent, it's not been determined. It has not been determined the extent to which women appropriate social media platform for information about their reproductive health. So, for the purpose of this research, I want to look at how women utilize social media platform to gain knowledge, disseminate knowledge about their reproductive health, and I also want to investigate how misinformation occur in women's utilization of social media platform for generation of knowledge about their reproductive health. And then I try to project or understand what this information portend for women's reproductive health. I also use arguments from transnational feminism to argue that the misinformation or the misinformation on about women's reproductive health on the social media is a form of epistemic violence against women, in the sense that while a lot of women are misinformed, deliberately send out false information about their reproductive health, a lot of women still do not have enough information about their reproductive health in ways that can enrich their life. And then I argue that it's a form of epistemic violence against them. So earlier on, I said that women's bodies are sites of interest for everyone. And aside that, on the social media, I think if you're familiar with how the social media works, you know that the women's bodies are always topic of discussion on social media platform. If men are not body shaming women, they're talking about their bodies, how much they love their bodies, and the kind of pleasure or displeasure that the woman's body can give to them. So for the purpose of this research, I'm also arguing that women's bodies are also sites of unsolicited information on all social media platform. Women's bodies are sites of online content generation. Of course, with the social media, the concept of content generation has arisen. And with that, a lot of people utilize social media platform to make money, to give out information, to put themselves there. And because women's bodies always generates public interest, the nature of information that can be generated about women's body also determine the number of likes and follows that we have, which by extension will increase the money that they can make on online platform. In addition to that, women themselves utilize the social media platform to um, share information about themselves, about their personal lives, about things they want. They also use it to seek information, to disseminate information, to share ideas about what they think they are knowledgeable about. And they also use it to rant. Like if so now there are some women-only groups, especially on Facebook and maybe barely on Instagram, where only women are members of this group, and then they're at liberty. They have the liberty and the anonymity to share their life out there without the fear of being judged or ascertained to be maybe unreasonable or very stupid. So an example of such an online platform is Female In on Facebook, which is more or less a no judgment zone. Women in that group share their stories, share their experiences, and then they sometimes ask for feedback. But then members of the group are allowed, or they are advised to be as polite, as kind, and as considerate as possible when they are maybe providing advice or sharing their opinion about the women's story. So online platform, we can also liken groups like this as, should I say, the shrink of women, because it helps women distress to rant and just take out whatever worries them, and then they get feedback in the process. So I argue that these online platforms, whether utilized by women for women or utilized by other people to talk about women's bodies, are also platforms that portray infodemic. And infodemic, according to WHO 2023, is the proliferation of misleading information that leads to confusion, mistrust of health authorities, and rejection of public health recommendation. I would like to say that this study is more or less a preliminary study. I can't claim to, no, I think I would say that what I just did is go through my data and then keep myself updated with latest literature on this. So preliminary findings from the data I have. Okay, let me talk about the data a little. I got the data from Facebook and Instagram using the keywords contraceptive, women's bodies, reproductive health, and the rest of all that. And what I'm basically interested in is the comments that comes as maybe solicited or unsolicited advice about the women's posts on things that has to do with their reproductive health. First of all, I will say that I got more comments using the keyword contraceptive. So it then appears that the use of or non-use of contraceptive is of paramount importance to a lot of women. Like contraceptive issues or issues around contraceptive is something that bothers women a lot, so much that they always want to hear people's opinion about it. Probably because some of them have had issues with failed contraceptive, and for some of them, complications or health complications that have arisen as a result of their use of contraceptives. So now talking about contraceptive, most of the comments are around the usage of contraceptive, like the use or non-use of contraceptive, and then the type, effectiveness, as well as the side effects of this contraceptive. On the right-hand side of the screen, I have some comments. Now, I have adapted those comments in their original form. There's no form of editing, so I downloaded them. They are just the way I downloaded from the internet. So if you can read what is there, I'm a Nigerian, so this is from Nigerian platform. So you would see like some Nigerian English words and Nigerian pidgin. So if you don't understand, I apologize, because it's basically Nigerian English. So the first comment is on Uda. Uda is, I don't know the English name for it, but it's a local Nigerian spice used to make pepper soup. Pepper soup is a very, very spicy meal in Nigeria. So a lot of women seem to subscribe to the use of Uda as a form of contraceptive. But as a result of my interest in women's reproductive health, I follow some medical doctors online who have maintained that UDA is not a form of contraceptive because it actually it does causes women to bleed. But it's apparent that a lot of women are not privy to this information. Also related to the use of contraceptive is the notion of men's use of contraceptive. And that has been a recurring question on the one hand, and then a no-go area on the other hand, because while a lot of women complain about the effects of contraceptives on their bodies, they've all agreed that, or majority of them have agreed that their spouses are not interested in using contraceptive. Related to that as well, so related to women's reproductive health is also the issues of and claims about fertility treatments. So they are unscientific and unsupported argument by the women that the use of contraceptive mars their chances of becoming pregnant when they choose to. So that has actually limited their use of contraceptive. So that is why they go for the natural or herbal concoction that they feel is working for them. However, a lot of them still complain that these herbal methods have failed them as well. So here I still have more comments from the women talking about the side effects of taking the contraceptive and the rest of all that. So what my basic argument here is that the way the women talk about their reproductive health, especially in the use of contraceptive, for instance, sometimes it's not just true. Sometimes they deliberately, that's why I put the "onto" in brackets, don't give out this false information because they don't use it. Or sometimes they will tell you, I heard, I've not used, I don't know how it works. So if you don't have empirical backing about the potency of such form of contraceptive, why tell people about it? So telling people about it is a form of disinformation or misinformation. In addition to that, some of women just share their personal experience and their limited knowledge about these things, not intentionally sway people, but just tell people what they know about all this. I also argue that women's perception and knowledge about their bodies and the use of reproductive health sometimes stems from the influence of societal conditioning that has made them feel that things about their bodies are taboos that they shouldn't talk about in public, and that there's a limit to what they can share about their bodies with their partners. It also stems sometimes from religious beliefs about women's bodies, about the use of contraceptive, and about abortion, pre-abortion and post-abortion care. Sometimes this misinformation also comes from, like I said earlier on, the use of online platform for content generation. And the social media algorithm and always ensures that once you watch a video about something, subsequently you get those kind of videos. So which then conditions the women's brain to feel that the misinformation they are being fed on is actually right, when in actual fact it is wrong. Then the misinformation on this platform as perpetrated by the women is sometimes born out of their distrust of medical practitioners. So maybe they've had some uncomfortable or traumatic experience with medical practitioners that have limited the trust they are able to place on orthodox medicine. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the spread of misinformation by women on social media platform results from the complex interaction between their individual needs as women, social-cultural factors, as well as the powerful influence of the social media as a sort of community and advice. This then shows the lapses of the Nigerian government in the context of this study. The Nigerian government has not done enough job of educating women about their reproductive health choices. And the consequences of this is explicated in reproductive health issues for a lot of women. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Helen. Angela, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Please let me know when I can start.
You can go ahead and start. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, hi, my name is Angela Dansajani. I am a third year PhD student at the University of Missouri, Columbia. And I focus in political science, focusing on international relations and comparative politics. And I focus primarily in race and international relations. And their intersections. And today I'm going to be speaking about race, ethnicity, and media responses to political violence. This is very much a preliminary study, so I need all the input that I can get because I am still developing this for my dissertation. This worked when I was setting it up. I don't know why this is not working all of a sudden. Oops. Sorry. Enter full screen, perfect. Okay, now, okay, so my research questions are, why do certain acts of political violence receive immediate, extensive media coverage while others, particularly those in the global South, are underreported or ignored? How does mainstream media decide which acts of political violence are relevant enough to report on? I came about this question by thinking about incidents like the Paris bombing, like even 9/11, the fact that when these incidents happen, it's immediately on every single news channel, from BBC to CNN. Granted, these are the countries that these things are happening in, but we see that on the biggest news channels, the biggest platforms, that is the only thing on everybody's lips. But when we see these same things happen, when there is a bombing in Syria, when there's a bombing in Congo, it may be a few months before anybody even knows it has happened. And so I want to study and really figure out, how is race informing that? So my theoretical framework also stems from a lot of the literature that is already there. And so a lot of the literature already talks about the direct relationship between the frequency of reported political violence as well as the occurrence of the events. So ideally, the more political violence happens in an area, the more likely there is going to be a higher coverage of media. So that should be like the ideal situation. And that is how media is supposed to work. You're supposed to report anytime an incident happens. But in this same literature, we find that in Northern media, and by Northern we mean the global North, the sources actually prioritize coverage of events that the journalists themselves deem as culturally significant for their audience. And so it reinforces any biases where issues that affect populations that resemble the Western societies or demographics, they are more likely to report on those issues. And so when acts of political violence happen in Western countries or Western adjacent countries, it's more likely to be reported than in all other areas. Why is this significant? I remember when the first invasion of Ukraine happened, the most recent one, and all the news channels began talking about it. Everybody was talking about, okay, war in Ukraine, Russia has attacked. But the narrative was a little different. And without even any provocation, the journalists themselves had to create their own narrative as to why they were covering Ukraine and not any other acts of political violence and any other war, interstate or interstate, that was going around in the world. And the amount of footage that I saw of journalists that said, well, it's not that this is more important than anything. It is that, you know, these are middle-class people. And, you know, they're just like us. They were making arguments for the similarities that they felt that they had to these Ukrainians. And so that is one of the biggest motivations for me to start looking into to see what is really the connection. What is the underlining things? What's the quiet part that we really don't want to say out loud? And so another thing that is within my theoretical framework is there is a hierarchy that exists in media reporting where countries with lighter skin majority or perceived proximity to whiteness will receive priority coverage, even when accounting for economic and political conditions. And so this is a follow-up to the previous one, where Eastern Europe, which sometimes is classified with Eurasia and, you know, certain parts of East Asia, is not considered white by a lot of Western countries, but conveniently, sometimes it gets co-opted. And so I really want to parse that. I want to parse through that to really see how are we categorizing these countries? How does that change based off of the issues that are happening? How are these dynamics changing based off of the circumstances that we're in, and how is the media framing it? And how is the media prioritizing things as well? And so my hypotheses. So the first hypothesis that I have is that media coverage of political violence in predominantly white or racially proximate regions will be more extensive and timelier than coverage of similar events in predominantly Black or non-white regions. And non-white is gonna be more focused in Black and predominantly Muslim countries. And it's the MENA countries, North African and Middle Eastern countries, even though Asian countries are very relevant a lot of times because of the political climate. It's more salient to look at those to really see more of a difference. I will look at a few Asian cases, but they're not my main goal. Granted, due to COVID, those things have, you know, inflamed. And then also looking at the higher levels of political volatility in a region will correlate with an increase in media coverage, particularly in the global north. And then I argue that coverage of political violence will demonstrate a hierarchical pattern with events in culturally proximate countries receiving prioritized reporting over those in regions perceived as distant or less relevant to Northern audiences. So I have started collecting data, and it is newspaper articles through Factiva. And so far, I am going by different events so that I can, you know, build my own data set. And so as of right now, I have 65, almost 66,000 articles that I get to play around with. And obviously I have events such as Israel-Palestine, but for the Israel-Palestine event, I'm actually not doing the whole entire, I'm not doing the whole entire conflict. I'm actually starting from October 1st, 2023. I'm still deciding whether I want to include from the very beginning. And then Rwandan genocide, Russia, Ukraine, the most recent one, 9/11, the Paris bombing, as well as several of the genocides, including the Darfur. and I'm still expanding these. And so for my methodology, there are 3 parts to my methodology. So my initial reporting, part 1 is the initial reporting. So part 1, the main goal is to determine the initial and subsequent levels of coverage for specific events. And so I'm using Factiva to analyze the unstructured data for the presence of genocide. So I code for the specific country the event happened in, the name of the event, or how the event would have been described at that time, and then genocide. I'm looking to see when was the very first time it was classified as a genocide. This is important. And the initial start date, I'm classifying that based off of ACLID and UCDP, mainly because, especially with some of the genocides, because there is no clear start date, having a particular consistent data set that I just referred to will allow my results to be consistent. And then part 2 is starting from that critical point of when each case has been deemed a genocide, that at that point, I start counting to see when they meet a specific coverage threshold. So that coverage threshold is to see their relevance. So being called a genocide is there, yes. And this will also change based off of the type of political violence, because obviously 9/11 is not necessarily a genocide because it was one specific event. But I will get there. So I will be using a hazard survival modeling system. And I am looking to see from that critical point where it was deemed a genocide, how long does it take for it to reach 50 articles? How long does it take to reach 50 articles? So even going back, as we can see in the dates that I have, some of these have longer timelines than others, but we see huge disparities in how many reports that are available. Obviously, the years that they're available is very important, and I will also have to keep that in mind. But all of those are things that I'm trying to work on. Those are things that I'm trying to work on. And so the reason why I chose 50 as well was to really see, I want to know the time it takes to become mainstream and to see what is influencing the delay. And so 50 is very much arbitrary. I just decided on it. I can reduce or increase based on anything, but I just decided to do half of 100. And then part 3 of my methodology is doing an analysis of the media framing. This is going to be both qualitative and quantitatively, looking at how media framing or media's perception of the whole issue affect the time it takes for the international community to recognize the event as salient, or how, so for example, the fact that certain issues will get branded as ethnic cleansing while others will get branded as genocide, does that influence whether the international community is more likely to intervene? Another important factor also is the fact that we know that a lot of times when there are issues in African countries, it's automatically labeled as like, oh, it's just ethnic conflict, it's just ethnic conflict. Well, if issues are just being colored as ethnic conflict and not as something more, quote unquote, salient, is it more likely to be dismissed or harder to get to the mainstream than not. And so that is the end of my methodology. So to run this research, there are quite a few assumptions that I have to make. First, I assume that media organizations operate within a framework shaped by audience preferences as well as societal bias, because I don't believe anybody works within bias. And this is also supported by previous literature. And then I also assume that the media landscape is hierarchical, where certain countries or regions, particularly those in the global north, receive preferential coverage. I assume that the level of political volatility in a region directly correlates with the frequency of media coverage. So the more incidents happen in a region, the more there should be media coverage. And that is the end of my TED Talk. So please, I am free for any questions. Stop my screen share.
Yes. Can you hear me? I have a question
Yes.
or comment. Given the timeliness of the Israeli-Palestine issue, but also Ukraine and Russia, those should definitely be part of your research. But also, for comparative sake, I think the Congo would be definitely good, and you're including that. But to make this dissertation feasible, to narrow it down to just a few cases, maybe 2 European, 2 African, or 2 European. The two. Well, when I say European, I'm actually Israel, Palestine. Okay, well, Russia, Ukraine, that's one. Then Israel, Palestine, Middle East. Then one in Africa, and then do one in Asia. Unless you can think of, trying to see if you can think of one in South America, maybe something, the Guatemala, El Salvador. But kind of to narrow it down, that way when you finish, you can kind of market yourself as an Africanist, but also a Middle Easternist in a sense as well, or European. You know, pick between 3 to 5, but definitely Israel, Palestine, I would argue, and perhaps even Ukraine and Russia, because they're so timely. And so I think that's more feasible.
Yes, so for a comparative study, I will only pick a few, but because I focus on international relations, they require me to have a large N.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
They that's the number one thing. Where's your large N? How are you doing across? Yeah, so I need multiple, because it needs to be generalizable. And
wow.
yes.
See, even the process limits your exposure. I mean, but I said the reason I mentioned the Congo is that I know it's occurred for a long time, and then there's a lot more deaths, and we hear nothing about it. But if you do a large N, that's kind of like an all lives matter approach, right?
Yeah.
But anyway. It sounds interesting.
Thank you. I mean, if anybody's talking, we can't hear y'all. Y'all are muted.
Okay. If not, I have another.
Okay. We were muted. Hi there,
Yeah,
Angela. Thank you so much for both of your talks. I wanted to say, Angela, that my name is Ithar Hasabal. I'm from Sudan originally. And I would love for you to take a look at the most recent war that began in April of 2023, because it is a full-blown war. And I still don't think that there is enough coverage. I definitely agree with all of the timely wars that you have mentioned, Israel, Palestine, you know, Russia, Ukraine, right? But I just think that due to the hunger challenges and all of the other challenges occurring, and millions of people being displaced, including my own family members, would love for you to take a look at that, because I still don't see it on the news. Like it's not there. And children are dying of hunger. So thanks so much, Angela. Big props. This is awesome. And I think it's going to be you know, I just cannot wait to read your research and
Mhm.
see you on the media as well.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Your name again, please. Sorry.
Ethar.
Thank you.
Ethar, Ithar. I'll find you. I'll find you.
Thank you.
I'm at the Kansas Health Institute.
So I'll add just a small point while we're waiting for more contributions, that there's something to be said about the simultaneity of the cases too, potentially. So that suggestion is good for the issue of the simultaneity. It may not be a determining factor at all in your case selection, but it could be interesting. We have a question.
Thank you. So I am Chibuzo Azubike from the Kansas African Studies Center. I have this question for Helen for your presentation. I like the topic, you know, it's novel, you know. But I'm just thinking, when you talk about misinformation, about, you know, that these women are sharing about health, reproductive health on social media, from your presentation, some of the things, you know, they talked about, they stem from indigenous knowledge, right? They are basically what has been transmitted from one generation to the other. And you know that, you know, in this world that we are in, African traditional knowledge systems or African, you know, traditional medicine systems, you know, is being downplayed, you know. So I don't know, how do you want to prevent, you know, that from showing up in your research? Remember that some of these indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices may not have, you know, may not, you know, they may not necessarily fulfill, you know, Western paradigms. You know, they may not be subjected to what we think as Western medicine. But over the years, over the generations, it's been pragmatic. It's worked for the people, right? So how do you want to ensure that, yes, you're talking about misinformation, but then you're also not falling into that victim. You're not falling into that trap of downplaying, you know, African oral indigenous traditional medicine systems. Does that make sense?
To respond to that. Okay, as much as it seems I might be falling into the trap of displacing African herbal medical system is, I would like to say that, you know, one of the downsides of African herbal medical system is the fact that to some extent it's not prescriptive, and then you cannot measure it. So if you cannot measure it, there's a tendency of it being abused. So some women will tell you, for instance, that they use 3 Uda seeds. They soak it in water for a number of days and they take it. Some of them will tell you they get up to like 10 or 20 and mix it with alcohol. I know anything you mix it with alcohol becomes much more potent and could cause other health effects. So the problem is not just taking this medical prescription or herbal concoction. It's the fact that, like I said, they're even concoction themselves. So you cannot ascertain their potency. And for some of them, they had like awful rippling effects that maybe made them bleed for a long time and they ended up in the hospital. So there's no prescription for it. There's no right prescription. There's no one. They cannot say, okay, take one shot of this every week, every day. Or, like, everybody just has their own thought of what they think is right.
Yes, just to follow up on this is just more a comment. I think to me the first epistemic violence I feel is me as a man not being able to feel, to be in your shoes, to know what women are going through. If I had a magical stick, I will transform myself to woman so that I can feel to be a woman 24 hours or something like that, so that I can feel what women are going through. And that if I have a magical stick, I think that's the first epistemic violence to me.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a question about the epistemic violence part of your presentation as well, and I wonder if you could elaborate on it. During the course of the conversations, this conference, because this is a theme of the conference, different people have articulated what the notion of epistemic violence is in the particular presentation. So I can see a couple of different ways it might apply, and one way is maybe the way Chibuzo is talking, that we have some African traditional knowledge systems and people can displace them or eradicate them or even perform some form of epistemicide, right? That's the kind of domination by Western knowledge systems that might happen.
Yeah.
So one could read this case to the extent that the practices have merit, then the displacement of them might be a kind of epistemic violence. But you're using the term in a different way, I think, or that could be one way it relates. But another way you're saying is, look, the fact that this information circulates online as knowledge and can result in harm because women may be investing truth into it and relying on it only to be disappointed in a serious way, that's certainly a kind of informational violence. If that's the kind of violence that you are calling epistemic violence, then where would you point a finger at the actor in that epistemic violence? As you're saying, it's not necessarily, you don't want to blame the women themselves. I got that point. So is it the state because they leave this vacuum open to fill? I mean, you can say more about that.
Okay, yeah. So I blame the states. Now, as much as Nigeria has institutes and centers for information dissemination, some of these, now this is mean, I am not criticizing the Nigerian government because a lot of Nigerian citizens themselves are also complicit in this. Like some of them don't do what they are supposed to do, and then these institutions or centers of research are not doing their job right. But a lot of people out there, a lot of women out there are not privy to information about what they should know. So I would still say that the state is complicit because the state is funding these institutions. So the states, I'm blaming the states.
Yeah, to Usman's point, is often the men who are in charge or
Exactly. Yeah, so that is also why I'm blaming the states, because the question is why put men in charge of issues that have to do with women? Like men cannot understand women's bodies. Like men cannot understand women's issues. So to get good results or to get the right appropriate result to solve women's issues or women's problems or women's challenges, a woman should be in charge of the decision making. But again, because of patriarchy that assumes that women do not know anything or women are not as knowledgeable as men tend to occupy the position or the decision making position at the detriment of women's health.
All right. Do we have any questions online? All right. Yes, Tonya, you can go ahead. Oh, she's clapping. Okay.
Thank
Right.
you. Yeah, no question, just yes, that was wonderful.
Okay, thank you. No questions. All right. Thank you so much for our presenters, and thank you everyone who has attended this session. I will invite Glenn to talk about the next session that we have, which will be a symposium at 2:30. So Glenn, do you want to?
I think that's all that we need to say is just the next session will come at 2:30. So please, we will like to see you there.
Yeah, and it will be on this same link. We're having it in one room, this room. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thanks.